Now that we've covered the basics of MySQL and phpMyadmin, in this video tutorial, we're going to get a little bit more practical. We're actually going to build a database and a table, and maybe we'll insert some data into the table using phpMyadmin. And the reason for doing this is a couple of reasons. First of all, we need a table that we can communicate with using PHP. I want to introduce you to some more concepts with regards to databases and MySQL. Not so much to get us bogged down in theory, but as we're building the table, I'll point out a couple of things. For this video tutorial, I'm using WAMP since I'm using Windows. This is very similar in terms of XAMPP or MAMP on the Mac, in that what we need to do now is launch phpMyadmin on your local machine. What I mean by your local machine, I mean on the box you happen to be doing your PHP work on. So on Windows, I'm just going to go to this MAMP control panel here. I'm going to launch the phpMyadmin. As you know from the previous video, phpMyadmin runs in your web browser, and I know I'm here because I'm at localhost/phpMyadmin. The address will be pretty much the same if you're using XAMPP or MAMP on the Mac. The point is, you want to get to this phpMyadmin screen. This will allow us to create our database. So first thing we need to do is we got to scroll down and we got to select the create database field here. So I'm going to just call it let's call it well, I'll just call it killer for sake of simplicity. Now this drop down menu deals with something called collation type. It's hard to describe without getting into nerd details, but just leave it like this at the default, and you can see that the default is UTF-8 Unicode here, so you can select it here, you can override it here. So we're just going to leave it like this for now, and we're going to hit create. So you can see here, SQL query create database killer. Let me explain this. SQL is the short for structured query language. This is the universal language of relational databases. Since MySQL is a relational database, it uses this language. A structured query language is a type of programming language that's used to interact with the database. So some of you may be thinking, well, aren't we going to use PHP to talk to the database? Yes, we are. But in between PHP and the database, in this case, the database is MySQL, we have to use the language, the universal language of databases called SQL. Fortunately, SQL is really, really easy to learn and to use for the most part, especially for the type of stuff we're going to be doing and for most of the PHP work you're going to be doing. So as we go along, we're going to learn a little bit of SQL along the way. Again, don't worry, SQL is pretty easy. For instance, this first command, create database, that's actually SQL, and we call it a database killer. So that's an actual real life SQL command. So as you can see, it's pretty easy. So if we look on the side here, we notice we have the database killer. You see we have our different databases here. These come standard with phpMyadmin, except for the WordPress one, of course, which I put in before myself. So we have killer. You notice we have the number in brackets beside it says 0, whereas here it says 17 and WordPress is 10. This number is the number of tables inside a database. If you recall, databases contain many tables, and inside the tables is where the actual data is held. So let's now create a table inside of the database killer. So we know we're in the database killer as far as phpMyadmin is concerned, because if you look on top here, just like breadcrumbs in a website, we have database killer. So I select it. So I select database killer, and here we go. We got the create table on database killer. So I'm going to create a table. I'm going to call it people. Number of fields. As I explained in the previous video, the number of fields is how many columns that you're going to have in the table. Each field represents a different piece of information. So in this case, since we're going to call the table people, it's pretty obvious that we're going to contain, inside the people table rather, we're going to have information about people. So things we might want to have is their name, their age, their sex, for instance. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, for sake of simplicity, I'm just going to say 3 fields. Each field represents a different piece of information we want to track about people. So I'm thinking age, name, and sex. We may, for instance, in a real database, you may want to track a whole bunch of other information, zip code or etc. So, I'm just going to keep it really simple. I'm just going to keep 2 fields. I just want to track their age and their name, perhaps. So I'm just going to hit go, and what this will do, it will create a table. We'll create, the data. Yeah, we'll create the database table inside a killer. So here we go. The dialog box expands here, meaning the screen here. And this is a bunch of extra information we got to set up about this particular table. Now, let's call this field, we'll call it name. And I'm going to call this sex. Now, what's this type field? Now, database fields can be different. They can be of different types, data types as they're called. So how can I explain this in a non-nerd way? Essentially, data is stored in different ways depending on the type of information you're storing. For instance, text is a different type of information from an integer. An integer is just a number, right? Or year information, for instance. Now you may figure, well, years is just text. It is, but by saying this is a year, MySQL basically adds a lot of extra capabilities, so it will make it really easy for you to do date operations, things like adding dates and subtracting dates and so on. So if this field is actually tracking the date of birth, I would say this is a year type of field. If you get the idea. So then you got all kinds of different things like tiny blob and blob. Blob would be for storing images. Let's say you want to store images inside of your database table. In this field, you would have to set it as the type blob. Blob basically means like a blob of data, a bunch of data, like bits and bytes. Things like images, videos could be stored in here. Although it's not a good idea to store actual images inside a database, but I have to get into that another time. So you got a whole bunch of different types here. For the sake of our video, I'm just going to say it's varchar. Now it's going to ask you a length for a value. So basically, this is how many characters. Var means variable character, right? So it's going to ask with length slash values. This column here is basically asking us how much space do you want to give this field in terms of text. So I'm just going to say 250. Maximum is 256. If you need to store names that are longer than 250 characters long, then you could use something like I think you could use text, for instance. That gives you a lot more space. But we're just going to say varchar for now. That's enough. We'll leave all this because it's not really important for our needs. The only thing we want to look at is this null thing. Now, this is interesting. Now, databases, fields, columns could have a value, of null. What does null mean? It means simply empty. Empty is different from 0. It's a nerd thing. It's a database thing. It just means there's no data in here. So when it's asking here, do you want null or not null? Basically what you're specifying is whether or not MySQL will let you enter a record that has a null value in this particular field here, the name field. In this case, we want to make sure that somebody puts in their name. So we're going to say that it's a not null because we want somebody to actually put in the data. So these other options for this particular situation is not so important. So let me scroll down here. This one, actually, I'm going to change this to ID. I'm really making this short. Now, every record should have an ID, right? So you can identify it. So I'm going to call this ID. I'm going to call it int ID because ID should be int. I'll leave that blank for now. I'm going to scroll over. I'll leave this to not null. Now here's the new and interesting thing we're going to do. You see this little key here, primary? So I'm going to select that. So what is this? This is the primary key. That's what the nerds call it. They call it the primary key. And what does that mean? essentially in every table almost, just about, of course you can have tables that don't have primary key. They need, in most tables rather, you need one of the fields, one of the columns has to be the primary key. The primary key is basically the column that has a unique ID, an address if you will, that identifies the records. And that's essentially what this is. We'll get more into this later on, but understand that we need this. We need to have a primary ID for many tables. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to hit go, and we'll see what happens. Actually, to save this table, you have to hit save. Forget about go. Excuse me. That's if you want to add a field. So I'm just going to save, and once again you see table killer people. Excuse me. Table killer dot people has been created. So what MySQL is telling us that inside of the database killer, we've created a table. We've created, excuse me, the table named people. Again, if you look SQL query, once again, you can use SQL to actually create the table inside of our database. So here's the actual SQL code. We'll get into this in another video. But if you look over now under our database drop-down menus here, you notice now there's a 1 beside killer, and you notice there's a little picture of a table, and it says people. So we click on that, and you can see we are inside of now our table people. Of course, table people has no data in it because we haven't put any data into it. So we know that because if you look at this warning message up here, MySQL return an empty result set, i.e. 0 rows. A result set is basically the result of asking MySQL for some information. So if you look at this SQL query, MySQL said basically sent a command via SQL programming to the MySQL database, basically asking for any records inside of the table people. We'll get into this a little later on. But so as you can see, MySQL, phpMyadmin rather, gives us a lot of information about the table. If we scroll down here, you see we can actually see the breakdown of the table as we created it. So you see we have the field name ID, we got the type, collation. The collation, as we talked about that a little bit earlier. And you can see we can edit all kinds of information about the table if we choose to. I just noticed something I've forgot to do with the ID column here. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to hit this little pencil, which means change. There's one thing I want to change about this table. I want to make it an auto increment, excuse me, this column or this field. I want to make it an auto increment. So what does that mean?